And hello, everyone, and welcome back to Two Guys in a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And over there is my great friend, William Bell, over in Memphis, Tennessee, wearing one of his duller shirts. I don't know what to think about that one, William. It's just really dull, but it's beautiful.
Yeah, I thought I'd toned down a little bit.
Oh, goodness gracious. Yeah, that color reminds me of some of the old performance cars from back in the 60s. They had um, Mopar had a plum purple color that they had in their Chargers and Barracudas and what have you. Boy, they were pretty cars. They were awesome. So anyway, well, listen, first of all, I want to thank you and Larry so very much for filling in for me last week. During the day, my blood pressure spiked on me for who knows why. And I really, really got to feeling bad. And for about the last 2 weeks, I've been experiencing some equilibrium issues. Um, Started about 2 weeks ago. My feet hit the floor and, the room just started spinning. And I kind of stood there for a moment and it kind of settled down. And it was bad all day long. I took a product called Antivert, which is for equilibrium issues. It's especially for flying. But nonetheless, ever since then, and it's not every day, I don't know what kicks it in. I don't know what keeps it from coming on. Yesterday, the minute my feet hit the floor, I was on top of the world. I was like, wow, I feel fantastic. Day before that, it was like, whoa, hang on here. Let me hold on to something while I walk. So it's been just really, really crazy. Do you ever experience things like that?
Well, if you're talking about equilibrium and your balance, etc.,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm having a lot of that lately. Uh, it's rare that I don't seem to be
Well,
stumbling and falling very much. I don't know what's causing it, and probably need to go to the doctor and check it out. But yeah, I've experienced that.
well, the see, 3 days ago, I had a pretty bad spell with it. It was last Friday. And thankfully, I had an appointment with an ear doctor anyway. I go in periodically and have my ears cleaned out, to have my hearing checked, et cetera, et cetera. And they always just tell me, "Oh, you're getting old. You can't hear." And I've got my hearing aids in right now, so that's where I'm at. But anyway, I told her the doctor what was going on, and she said, "Yeah, you're not doing. Yeah, that's not right." So she ran some tests on me, and she she made me do the test, with one foot in front of another, walking a straight line. Well, as long as I had my eyes open, I was fine. She said, "Okay, now do it with your eyes closed." And I said, "No, no, no, we're not going to do this."
He
So,
didn't ask you what brand of whiskey were you drinking this?
no, so she said, "Well, you've got something going on. I don't know what it is, so we'll give you some more tests and all that kind of stuff." But I'm real sure of one thing, William. It cannot be us getting old, right?
Yeah, yeah, I got that. You got that right.
Yeah, it can't be that. So anyway, I don't know what it is, but boy, it's really disconcerting.
Yeah.
You turn around too quickly, you stoop over, you bend over, you stand up too quickly, whatever, and all of a sudden you're just going, okay, let me hang on to something here, and then you're okay. Um,
Yeah, since the accident, I kind of leaned forward a little bit, from the back injury, et
yeah,
cetera. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe I'm just leaning too far and my head's too big and throwing me off balance. And so I try to straighten up a little bit, but that doesn't help much. So
yeah.
uh, I guess it's something else going on. Like you say, it's aging.
Well, Jan's got an exercise for me to do. I was extremely skeptical of it. And the
Mhm.
very first time I used it, lo and behold, it did do some good. And it involves putting the head back and then getting on my knees, putting the head all the way down to the floor, turning it to the right, turning it to the left. And each time I put it in the different position, it's I count to 30.
Okay.
And it works. I mean,
Yeah.
it certainly gives me some relief from the bad symptoms of the moment. I'll say that.
Well, I was uh, watching. I don't know if I watched it all the way through, and maybe I did, but I just ran across the video across a video on yesterday on YouTube that talked about exercises that you could do that would improve your balance as you
Ah,
age. It wasn't exactly what you were doing, but it was some things that, he did in terms of his legs, arms, and different positions and looking in different directions, etc. So I'm going to go back and try to find it now that you said that and you say you got some relief, and I'll see
well,
if that
yeah,
works.
it definitely helped. And Jan started doing it because she had some equilibrium problems,
Mm-hmm.
and she discovered this from a doctor. And the doctor said, "You may laugh at this, but just try it and try it a couple of days in a row and see if it doesn't help." And she swears up and down by it. And one of the days that mine was just particularly bad, she said, "Okay, here we go. You're going to do this whether or not you want to." And I did. And it was like, hey, that worked. So
Good.
anyway,
Well,
well, William, I don't have to tell you, I know that Syria is in the news. And before we get into our discussion and continuation of the Messianic temple. And I started to say a few moments ago, I want to thank you and Larry again for filling in last week. I would not have
well,
been a good show host.
well, you're quite welcome. We enjoyed ourselves as we always do. So,
Oh yeah, yeah. Larry's a great guy. He has great insights and what have you. So I knew the program was most assuredly in good hands. I hated like crazy to miss it, and believe you me, I was not having a good time. But anyway, I do want to thank you guys so very, very much. And Larry, if you're watching, thank you so very much. I've already sent him a private message expressing my appreciation. But it's really great to have men that you trust, that you know are knowledgeable, that you know you can rely on to be solid in their presentations and what have you. It's a great blessing, and I do appreciate it. So, as I
good
was
to see you
saying,
back and doing better.
well, thank you. Uh, as I started to say there, Syria is in the news. Damascus is in the news. And the minute I saw the headlines that Syria had fallen and Bashar, or whatever his name is, had fled off to Russia, I knew very good and well that the headlines on YouTube videos was going to be the fulfillment of last days prophecies. Isaiah chapter 17.
17.
And so I got on YouTube, and lo and behold, guess what? All of these YouTube videos, the fall of Damascus, the fall of Syria, this is proof positive we are in the last days. And what's interesting about this, William, is some years ago, I've forgotten the exact year now, but there were some events in Syria, and the prophecy pundits were all over it, saying the exact same thing. Now, if I'm not mistaken, and I lose track of time very easily, always have. I'm not good at remembering dates, never have been. But the prophecy pundits were saying that was the fulfillment of prophecy. And again, what I started to say was, I think that was somewhere around 7 or 8, maybe 9 years ago. But nothing happened. The rest of the end time prophecies didn't come to pass. So now all of a sudden, in fact, I saw one YouTube video. I didn't watch it all the way through. I watched just enough to see what he was saying. He had a whiteboard in the back and he said, okay, here's Syria and here's this and here's that and here's Moab. And, it just went all the way down through it, through the geography. And he said, but right here, ladies and gentlemen, this is Syria. This is Damascus. This is the focal point of this prophecy. And he goes Isaiah chapter 17. Well, there's no question that Isaiah 17 foretold the fall of Damascus, the fall of Syria. But William, I've read this chapter, I don't know how many times down through the years, every time the prophecy pundits point to it. One of the most glaring things that I see about it is that there's something missing. Now, I don't want to be guilty of what's known as a negative fallacy and say, well, because this exact term isn't found, that means it couldn't be that. And yet, at the same time, if you're going to apply it to the last days, then maybe we ought to have some indication that it is about the last days. That's my point. But the point of it is the term last days doesn't appear in the text. What it does say, it uses the terminology of it shall come to pass in that day. Well, that's not a last days prediction. It is simply a reference to an antecedent discussion. And in this case, the antecedent discussion is, and I'll just read it, Isaiah 17, verses 1 and 3, the burden against Damascus, behold, Damascus will cease from being a city, and it will be a ruinous heap. The cities of a roar are forsaken. They will be for flocks which lie down, and no one will make them afraid. The fortress also will cease from Ephraim, the kingdom from Damascus, and the remnant of Syria. They will be as the glory of the children of Israel, says the Lord of hosts. Hey, there it is. There's a prediction of the destruction of Damascus. William, how do we know it's not talking about what just happened today or 3 or 4 days ago?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly, this prophecy is dealing with something that happened way in the past and has nothing to do with, what we're looking at today. We're talking about, ancient Israel from that perspective. And so, this is not a prophecy that refers to events of today.
And for everyone who's watching, I wrote a short article and I posted it on my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. And oh, by the way, folks, my bookstore has been moved to a slightly different location. Russian hackers have been trying to take over my website. And so we've had to do a bunch of redo. And so my bookstore has been moved to a separate site, but you can go to my regular site, donkpreston.com or Bible Prophecy, and follow the links to the bookstore. But they're separate independent websites now for those who are interested in knowing that, and I hope you are. But I posted this article on the prophecy of the destruction of Syria. And let me make this further observation about my website. In the incident that I mentioned a few moments ago, 8 or 9 years ago, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago, whatever it was, Gary DeMar wrote a rather lengthy article. I broke it up into 5 different installments, and I posted those 5 installments on my website. So if you want to read what Gary DeMar had to say, and it's still just as relevant today as it was back then go to my website, donkpreston.com, and in the search bar, just type in Isaiah chapter 17, and all of Gary's articles will be found there. And you really need to read them. But the main thing that I want to get at, William, is what you just touched on, and that is that Isaiah 17 was fulfilled millennia ago, 2 millennia ago almost. And if you want to say 2 millennia, that's fairly accurate. And a matter of fact, I think it's really interesting. And to me, tell me if you agree with this, William. It seems to me that the great majority of the dispensationalists do not spend any time reading historical works. And by that, I mean encyclopedias, dictionaries, and correlate it with with passages like Isaiah chapter 17. They just automatically conclude, oh, look, this is a prediction of the destruction of Damascus and Syria. That's what we're seeing today. It must be about today. But if they spend any time with what are effectively, essentially, secular works written by historians, but who understand the correlations between scripture and history, you can go to Collier's dictionary. You can go to the Jewish encyclopedia or Jewish dictionary and encyclopedia. You can go to the American encyclopedia. You can go to Smith's Bible Dictionary. Now, these are just some that come off the top of my head. I've got a whole list of them in my database. And each one of these document that Isaiah 17 was fulfilled in approximately 732 BC at the hands of Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria. Folks, there's a difference between Syria and Assyria. It can be confusing, but they are different. So, what are your thoughts on what I said there, William? Is it your experience that an awful lot of people just don't read secular works or even good religious works that are actually works on history as it correlates to some of these biblical prophecies?
Well, yeah, that's true because, we have, particularly with the dispensational view, they're always focused on the event that's happening around the corner, and nothing fuels that better than a current war, or the potential outbreak of a war, and maybe some other pestilence or something that they could attribute to it, that they sort of impose on the biblical end time. But it's very important that we look at the historical information, as you were suggesting, with all of those books, because what that does is it puts it in the right historical chronological time frame. There are evidences in these historical books that will support what you have in the scripture, to demonstrate these things were fulfilled in those times.
What's amazing to me about this, William, and I'm turning over to 1 Kings chapter 15 right now. Um, but I was privileged some years ago to be able to stand in front of a bas relief, what they call a bas relief, which is an inscription. It's an engraving in stone, and this was done by Sennacherib, but they had also inscriptions from Tiglath-Pileser, the very king that we're talking about here, that I'm going to read about in 1 Kings chapter 15 here momentarily. And it's so incredible. It's almost emotional to stand in front of an inscription from the 8th century BC that actually depicts in stone what we read about
Mhm.
in 1 Kings chapter 15 and 16. I mean, that's amazing. And when you stand in front of the inscription or the bas relief from the Chronicles of Sennacherib, some people call it Sennacherib. I think it's actually Sennacherib, but nonetheless, this bas relief is 26 feet long,
Wow.
and it's solid stone. And his sculptures, started here, and they chronicle the invasion of Israel, the siege of Lachish, which we find recorded in Scripture, and the siege of Jerusalem, which we find in Isaiah 29 through 37. Okay. Well, here is Sennacherib's story of his invasion. And what he said was, I invaded the land of Egypt, and I utterly destroyed, I pillaged and turned into ruins 46 cities. And I captured, let's see, how did he put that? I besieged the city of Jerusalem and held the inhabitants thereof like a bird, of the king thereof, like a bird in a cage. Now, what's interesting about this is, and historians know all about this kind of history, his bas relief is what is known as a panegyric history. That's a big fancy word, but in other words, what it means is the king told all the good stuff about himself. He conveniently left out some really bad stuff about himself. Well, the really bad stuff is found in Isaiah, obviously, 36 and 37, that the angel of the Lord, the angel of death, as some people call him, passed through the Assyrian camp as he was before the walls of Jerusalem, and 186,000, 185,000 Assyrian soldiers died in one night. Well, the bas relief doesn't record that.
Ah.
uh,
That's like the hunter telling the story instead of the lion, right?
yeah, exactly. That is exactly right. So, but the same thing happens here with Tiglath-Pileser. His chronicle records his victory. Okay, not anything about a defeat, because in 1 Kings chapter 15, what we have is the story all the way through the chapter, all right, about his triumphant march and conquering the cities of Syria and laying Damascus waste. Well, in 1 Kings chapter 16, we find how he specifically mentions Damascus, the city, and how he had laid it waste. So, in other words, what we've got, and I said First Kings, I think, but it's actually Second Kings. But the point of fact is, here we have in 2 Kings 15, 2 Kings chapter 16, we have the specific record and history of what was predicted in Isaiah chapter 17. And William, I can tell you, I have talked to any number of dispensationalists who are just absolutely convinced. I'm trying to get a pen as a marker there. Absolutely convinced that Isaiah 17 is talking about our day. And when I take them to 2 Kings 15 and 16, it's like, well, that's a different story. That's a different time. That's a different invasion. And when I ask for the proof of it, none is given. I want to shift gears at this point just a moment, William. Pardon me. And I'm not going to take the time to read 2 Kings chapter 15 and the relevant text there. I would just encourage the people to read 2 Kings chapter 15, 27 through, let me see, it's 31. And then 2 Kings chapter 16, 9 and following. For yourself, just take the time to read it. But William, I had someone pose a question to me when in my video, and I said 2 Kings 15 and 16 is the fulfillment. And they said, how do you know that it's not typological of some event in our day? So how would you answer that?
Well, the only thing I would say to that, one, because a lot of these prophecies sometimes do have some typological significance, but none of them would be in our day, for the simple fact that all Bible prophecy was fulfilled, of course, in the fall of the temple in 70 AD. So that just wipes out any application to these things beyond that period of time. There is no more prophecy and no more fulfillment of prophecy that occurs outside of that framework. What I was otherwise going to say in terms of, this destruction and defeat, even though, we see the fulfillment here very specifically and very particularly in, that time of the, latter 8th century time frame. If we look at, maybe the war in Jerusalem and surrounding areas of some battles that could have occurred, you might look at some, because there was some involvement, with Syria during those times, even involved in the destruction of Jerusalem. But that would be as far as you could extend anything as far as prophecy was concerned.
Yeah, it's a great point too. Well, one of the things that I point out in the little video that I produced, and then the article, I think I said article, but it was a video that I produced and posted today. And here's what's amazing to me about this. Mark Hitchcock, I had a formal debate with him at Thomas Ice back 2008, somewhere along in there. And Mark Hitchcock, when the situation arose a few years ago about Damascus and Syria, Mark Hitchcock actually wrote on it. And he said, it just won't work. Here's a dispensationalist. And he said, no, you cannot apply Isaiah 17 to what's happening today. And here's the reason that he gave. And I thought, hey, he sees something. He's throwing up a red flag. And for a dispensationalist to put up the red flag on what his fellow dispensationalists are saying and throwing cold water all over it, I thought, that's real good. Here's what Mark Hitchcock himself pointed out from Isaiah chapter 17. Verses 1 to 3, destruction of Damascus and Syria. Now watch verse 4. And it shall come to pass in that day that the glory of Jacob will wane, and the fatness of his flesh grow lean. It shall be as when the harvester gathers the grain, reaps the heads with its arm, and it shall be as he who gathers heads of grain in the valley of Rephaim. Yet gleaning grapes will be left in it like the shaking of an olive tree, 2 or 3 olives at the top of the uttermost. That's the salvation of the remnant concept, even back then in that historical situation. Verse 9, in that day, the day of Jacob's power waning, in that day his strong cities will be as a forsaken bow, and an uppermost branch which they left because of the children of Israel. There shall be desolation because you have forsaken the God of your salvation. So Mark Hitchcock says, look, guys, we can't apply Isaiah 17 to what's happening in the modern time, because at the same time Damascus is destroyed, Jerusalem is destroyed. Whoops.
Yep.
And the point I made in my video was, there's no way that you can argue that Jacob, i.e. Israel's power and glory is waning right now, because after all, Israel has basically destroyed Hamas, has essentially destroyed Hezbollah. Militarily, quote, Israel, unquote, is stronger right now than she was a year ago. And so, even though Isaiah 17 says that at the same time that Damascus is destroyed, that Syria is destroyed, Israel is devastated, that doesn't work at all. I have not found, William, one single dispensationalist that was aware of verses 4 and following, that had ever even read it. They had simply followed their prophecy experts who get on TV and produce their YouTube videos. Well, they've got to be right. This is it. We're in the last days. Comments?
Yeah, well, it just doesn't make any sense, as you were saying, when it comes down to what was supposed to happen to Israel in the end time. They're supposed to be victorious. They're supposed to exist forever. So no ending of them whatsoever, and to have a context that is demonstrating that, they're suffering defeat in the same time. Just, as you say, it doesn't work. It just will not work from that perspective. And I can see why there's avoidance of even dealing with it from that perspective.
Yeah, well, and to go back to what I said a moment ago, I was pleasantly surprised that Mark Hitchcock says, time out, guys. This is not going to work. You got to look at the context, which I don't think he does a good job of an awful lot of the time. He imposes his hermeneutic on an awful lot of passages, both Old and New Testament. But in this case, you have to give him credit for saying this is a wrong application. This is not the fulfillment. What is happening today is not the fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 17. So I just found it amazing. And I find it as a continuing source. I know you do as well. A continuing source, basically of frustration, to see the same story and the same storyline played out every single time something happens in the Middle East. These prophecy experts, it's almost like they've got a book manuscript written, William. All they do is change the dates and they change the names of the guilty. Except Israel, that's always, they just keep the storyline. And they crank out another book, sells 1 million copies or more, and people are just sitting there waiting to buy these books that in a year or 2 years will be discounted 90%. At $1 million books. Well, you can get a lot of this 1970s and 80s prophecy books at a real discount right now.
Yeah, and then if you go back and sort of trace through them, you will see where all of these failed prophecies are in those books. And they stop talking about it, and people forget about it as though they've never said it. It's like all we got to do is give you a whole new, different scenario and paradigm, and now you're off on that one.
Yeah.
If you go back, you remember all of these things when Iran and when the what was it, 25 member European Union and all of that, um, and yet all of it, nothing is talked about now after, the simulation of that. Nothing is said about it.
Yeah. And it's just like when the Berlin Wall came down, how Lindsay lied, overtly lied. And I'm not just simply saying this because he's dead and can't answer me. He wouldn't answer me even if he was still alive. He never would answer anyone. But the point of fact is, how Lindsay said when Russia dissolved and the Berlin Wall came down, I sat and watched him on TV. I shared this in my program with Mike Sullivan the other night on Preterist Apologetics. I was sitting watching when Hal Lindsey talked about the Berlin Wall coming down, Russia dissolving. He said, this is precisely what I predicted. He never did any such thing. That was a blatant, bald-faced, unmitigated lie. And I yelled that at the television. I got caught up in the moment. But anyway, when you point this out to people, it's like, oh, well, they've got the calculations now. What happened to all these past ones? And it's just a travesty, and it's harmful to the church, the wider body of the church in the broadest sense possible. Okay? It's detrimental to the cause of truth. When you have one failed prophecy after another, and by the way, William, brand new calculation out. Guy sent this to me just the other day. If the Bible is inspired, if the Bible is the Word of God, the end will be in 2051. Now, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be around by that time. Don't know about you, but I'm probably not going to be around at the time. But I told him, your prophecy will fail. But again, this is the frustration. Every time that you have 10 prophecies fail by the most prominent dispensational prophecy experts on the planet, and they assure us, we have read the Bible so carefully. We have investigated this so thoroughly. We know what we're talking about. And the prophecy fails. They never get on and say, well, folks, we thought we had it figured out. No, they don't do that. They get on, they say, here's what the Lord told me. And they change the dates. Well, didn't the Lord tell them the first time? I mean, what's going on here? So they keep kicking the can down the road. Well, that's a saying we used to have as a young guy. Kids today don't know what that means. But they just keep kicking it down the road far enough to where they're not accountable for their false prophecy. They're dead. They're gone. Their prophecy fails.
And as you indicate, when they're using these names in the Bible and ascribing them to events that are taking place in the world today, because of that association, that loose association with just name dropping, so to speak, so many people who are unaware and uninformed actually think that that's what's happening. It makes it easy for them to continue to do that. And most of these people are not reading anything for the most part. They're just getting their news from the television and from the tabloids, et cetera. And so when they hear these things, they come straight out and say, oh, we must be in the end time. Let anything happen.
Well, yeah, I think the point that you're making, correct me if I'm wrong here, but they seem to think that because the same region of dirt
Yes.
that had a name back then, that same region is the same dirt today, even though it has a different name. So they think it's automatically the same, but they're totally different kingdoms ruled by totally different people. And so they never stop to consider that. And it's anachronism exemplified is really what it is.
Mhm.
And I mean, it's a matter of false hermeneutic. That's really what it boils down to. And understanding the very form and nature and necessity for proper hermeneutic. Okay. Well, William, I think to get back to our subject of the Messianic temple, uh, I think that you and Larry finished going through chapter 7. Is that correct? You finished up on that?
Yeah, we did finish on chapter 7.
Okay.
Unless there were some other points that you wanted to deal with there. I mean, it's fine with me if we need to revisit a text or two in that chapter.
No, I don't know of anything. Um, I suspect you two were pretty thorough in it. You know, to me, the closing words here of Hebrews chapter 7, 25 to 28, they are just so cram packed with concepts, with ideas, many of them set in direct contrast with the Jerusalem temple of the day because of the abuses of the temple that were going on in that day, and the very nature of the Levitical priesthood because of its weakness that Hebrews chapter 7, 10, and 11 points out. If perfection would have been through the law, then verily, there have been no need for another covenant, what have you. So I suspect that you guys pretty well covered that. So why don't we look at the summary statement concerning the priesthood, but it's also a summary statement concerning the tabernacle temple motif that starts out chapter 8. Now, this is the main point of the things that we are saying, the writer says. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord erected and not man. Now, there's more than enough for us to chew on for the rest of this program this evening. But he is wrapping up everything that he has said, starting all the way back, really with verse 1
Yes.
of chapter 1 about the work of Christ, the propitiating work, the atonement work as the high priest. But as we have said before, you cannot separate the work of Christ as high priest from the work or from the Messianic temple. William, why don't you give us your synopsis of this synopsis in chapter 8, verse 1 and 2?
Okay. Well, as you were saying, the summary point that he's making is tied back all the way back to chapter 1. This reminded me of an outline I did on Hebrews when I was in seminary, and distributed it. But it was basically, going back through the chapter and looking at all the connections that dealt with the priesthood. But so that's the beginning. And so he says that's the main point of what he's saying, demonstrating that this whole book is about the priesthood of Christ, about the superiority of that priesthood over the Levitical priesthood, as was discussed in chapter 7 by the comparison between Melchizedek and Levi, etc. And then, he talks about having such a high priest that is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. And that demonstrates that Christ was raised from the dead, that he sits at the right hand of God, and that he was the minister of the true, of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle. In other words, that he has gone into the most holy place and was at that very time making the atonement for the people. And that being a contrast between the priests of the old covenant, who were serving in the types and shadows rather than in the true one, the reality. And what's interesting in this context is the true one is the one that's not seen.
Yeah.
It's the one that has no visibility, that's not tangible, that can be touched or felt or seen. As Larry pointed out last week, we look at the things which are not seen. And so this is the point of this tabernacle, whereas that which was physical and tangible was the copy and the example that was made from that true image that was in the heavens, the spiritual reality that's there. And then this concept of saying which the Lord erected and not man. And so you get to this distinction between that which was made with hands and that which was made without hands. And in that, it brings the temple concept together with the kingdom concept, because the first time you have this not made with hands concept found in scripture is in Daniel chapter 2.
Right.
34, 35, and 44 and 45. So it's in those verses that he talks about this kingdom cut out of the mountain, this stone cut out of the mountain without hands. And that just ties in with everything God has said about the temple, Isaiah 66, Acts chapter 7, the Most High does not dwell in temples made with men's hands, etc. So that's the contrast that he's bringing about. He's trying to take them into that reality, into that spiritual reality of the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched.
Yeah, some great points. It's something that we have talked about, and that's so critical to understand, is that the Old Covenant tabernacle and the Old Covenant, the physical temple of Solomon, was itself a type and a shadow, a foreshadowing of the genuine, the real, the Messianic, if you please.
Mm-hmm.
And here's what's interesting about this. It was very common in rabbinic circles in the ancient time. They talked about, in Hebrews chapter 9, see that you do all things, or Hebrews chapter 8, excuse me, all things according to the pattern showed you in the mount. That's building the tabernacle. So Moses was told, you build the tabernacle according to the pattern that was shown you in the mount. Well, the rabbis understood that to mean that the pattern for the tabernacle was heavenly. And you get all sorts of variants in those writings. Some of them believe that there was an actual, literal, physical tabernacle in heaven, and it served as the template for the physical tabernacle on earth. Some went so far as to say, well, there'll be an actual physical temple, Solomonic type temple in heaven, et cetera, et cetera. But most of them did not, it seems, to the very, very best of my knowledge at this point. They didn't believe that the one in heaven was an actual physical temple. It was a spiritual reality. Now, this, as we've pointed out many, many times on this program, this is really where it gets difficult for the dispensationalist to maintain their view of a literal, physical, messianic temple because of one word in Hebrews chapter 8. Christ has become the minister of the true tabernacle. Well, William, does that mean that the first tabernacle and the Solomonic temple, does that mean that they were, quote, false? What does the word true here mean?
Well, I haven't really looked at the original meaning of the term, but in the sense of what this is talking about, he's talking about true from the perspective of this was the original pattern from which the other one was made. And so from that perspective, it's the true one. It's also, as we were saying before, it's invisible. So when you look at the dispensational concept of them wanting to build another one, that becomes a conflict. In addition to the fact that this is one that was already being pitched. Now, if it's the true one that's already pitched, then how can you have another one which you could call true from that perspective? That just wouldn't make sense at all, in that context.
Yeah, and I think it's James D. Bales in his book on dispensationalism. I've got the book over here somewhere. Been a long time since I read it, but he made a comment that I think is so very, very good. And he focuses on the word true. And he asks the question, was the writer of Hebrews saying that the first tabernacle and the Solomonic and even the Herodian temple for that matter, was he saying that they were false temples? No, he's saying they were types. The types pointed to the real, which was the true. Kind of like Colossians chapter 2, 16 and 17, the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, which are a shadow of the good things that are about to come, but Christ is the body. Well, you know, if I walk out in the sunshine, which we haven't seen much of lately, but if I walk out in the sunshine, I will cast a shadow. The shadow is not the real, it's not the true. That doesn't mean it's false, but it means it points to the reality. And so that's what Bales points out as to the meaning of the true tabernacle. That what Jesus was doing, what Jesus is doing, serving as the high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek without priesthood without end, is he serves in that which was the goal of the shadow, which was foreshadowed in the first tabernacle, Solomonic temple, etc., etc. It's the reality. I don't know how that I don't know how a point could be any more devastating, William, to me at least, as I think about that, than that little word true. Because it says those things pointed to this. What was the this that it pointed to? Well, you went over it a moment ago that you and Larry discussed. The temple that Christ serves in, number one, it's heavenly. Number two, it's spiritual, not physical. And by the way, we need to make this point. You and I have made this many, many times down through the years. When we say spiritual, we don't mean unreal. The spiritual is the real, but the spiritual is the unseen, as you guys obviously discussed. And that goes to address an awful lot of objections. I mentioned J.D. Bales. J.D. Bales, and did you ever get to meet him, talk to him?
I never met him. I'm trying to see if I might have called him on the phone once. I talked
Okay.
to a lot of those guys back
Yeah.
then.
Yeah. I had the opportunity to visit with Brother Bales on several different occasions. My last time was at Tulsa, the soul winning workshop up there, and he was extremely bad health. But nonetheless, when he was first introduced to preterism, his response was, my eyes are not seeing what my ears are hearing. I know that you're familiar with that statement. Okay. I think you even wrote an article in response to that, if I'm not mistaken. But I shared that statement with you, I know. Well, here's the ironic thing about this. For those of you who never knew James D. Bales, he was a brilliant PhD scholar, he's a great guy on top of everything else, very humble man. But he wrote and lectured against dispensationalism over and over and over. His little book on dispensationalism is still extremely powerful. Now, he misses the point because he didn't see covenant eschatology. But many of the points that he makes is the problem with dispensationalism is they believe, and he talks about the temple, they believe that there has to be a literal physical temple out here in our future. And so the dispensationalist was saying, well, my eyes are not seeing what my ears are hearing. And Bales would say, I'm paraphrasing what he would say, Bales would say, you're looking with the wrong eyes. You're looking with the wrong eyes. You've got to see things with spiritual eyes. And he would undoubtedly appeal to 1 Corinthians chapter 2. The natural man cannot receive the things of God because they're foolishness to him. But we speak the wisdom of God, comparing spiritual things with spiritual. So that would have been, if I could put words in Bales's mouth or in his keyboard, That would have been what he said. And that is essentially what he did say. But when it came to answering covenant eschatology, what did he say? Oh, my eyes are not seeing what my ears are hearing. You preterists are talking about the coming of the Lord. Well, I didn't see that. You preterists are saying the resurrection. Well, my eyes didn't see that. You preterists are saying the kingdom. And then Bales might have gone, well, wait a minute. The kingdom doesn't come with observation.
Yeah, I was just thinking that that was the major issue that would arise in his premise about my eyes are not seeing what my ears are hearing. You know, what's he going to do when he confronts the kingdom, which he's been arguing for against the premillennialists that whole time in his book?
And that I confronted him with that at Tulsa. Now, I didn't press the point because, like I said, he was gravely ill. He died not long after that, as a matter of fact. But I just asked him, I said, Brother Bales, how can you argue my eyes are not seeing what my ears are seeing when you've written what you have against dispensationalism? And I mentioned the kingdom, and he didn't want to talk. Now, I'm not going to accuse him of anything because it was more so obvious that he was feeling terrible. I commiserated with him. I told him how much I appreciated the work that he had done throughout his life and the value that he had been to the kingdom and what have you. And we left on very amicable, very friendly basis. I shook his hand, he shook mine, and what have you. But he had never been confronted that way to say, you say the kingdom does not come with observation when you're talking against the dispensationalists. But now all of a sudden you are saying, well, you preterists are wrong because I'm not seeing what my ears are hearing out of you. Well, let's talk about the kingdom. Go ahead.
You know, that whole idea, when you start talking about the kingdom, and as we were looking at in Hebrews 8, 1 and 2, he's the majesty of, or rather, he sits at the right hand of the majesty in the heavens. So there's your kingdom and temple concept in one. So when you're saying that the kingdom does not come with observation, you're saying the temple does not come with observation. You're saying that Christ does not come with observation. And pretty much everything else that relates to the eschatological scene does not come with observation. And that's a point that people are still struggling with today. Even in preterist circles, they're still struggling with it, and they're still trying to impose, physical concepts on those things in order to, validate their opinions of them. So it's a major issue from that perspective. But if they understood, and that's what Christ was doing, even in his return, manifesting himself in this very position and scenario that we're dealing with here. He sits at the right hand of the majesty in the heavens, revealing himself not as he came the first time, but revealing himself as a divine being, as God, and that's hard to grasp for some to see that. They got to keep him in a state of humiliation in order for them to believe who he is. I don't know how much that helps because there were so many people who saw him in that state and didn't believe it.
Well, no, I think the point is extremely valid. And by the way, this is the point I made in my recent debate with Richard Carrier. Richard Carrier, if you remember, began the debate by saying Jesus agreed with the common Jewish belief of the day concerning the coming Messiah. He would be a conquering warrior to defeat the Romans, to sit on a physical throne in Jerusalem. That was Carrier's opening argument. Well, I had anticipated that, of course, and I had a chart in which I presented, pointing out the Jews offered Jesus the very kind of kingdom that they wanted. He turned it down. When Pilate asked him, "Are you the king?" he said, "Yes, I am." Well, okay, then what kind of a king are you? Well, if my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight? And Pilate said, and Pilate, by the way, was absolutely paranoid. I mean, to the point of killing hundreds and thousands of people. Literally, I'm not exaggerating, who he believed were wanting to be insurrectionists against the power of Rome. And yet here's Jesus, and he says, "Are you the king?" "Yes, I am." You rightly stated, "But my kingdom is not of this world." "Oh, well, then you're no threat to me. Get out of here." "Oh, well, I want to turn him loose." Well, no, okay, I'll turn Barabbas loose instead. So I just went down the complete list, not a complete by any means, but a list of the things, and I'm sure Larry focused on some of these. When Paul is talking about the change from death to life and from covenant glory to covenant glory in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and chapter 4, and he talks about it under the umbrella of resurrection, though our outward man is perishing, yet our inward man is being renewed by day. He said, "We do not look at the things that are seen, but at the things that are unseen." The things that are seen, they are temporal. The things that are unseen are eternal. And this is a resurrection passage. And so for Paul, resurrection was not something that can be seen. And yet, Richard Carrier says, "I didn't see bodies coming out of the grave. Nobody else has seen bodies coming out of the grave." And this to me was a real, very, very, very telling point in the debate, William. I don't know if you remember it or not, but I posed the question by asking, Hymenaeus and Philetus said the resurrection has already passed. So I would like for Richard Carrier to tell us how it would be possible for anyone to convince anyone that Richard's view of the nature of the resurrection had already taken place. He had no answer for that, except to say, well, it's possible that Hymenaeus and Philetus were saying that the entire number of everybody that was going to be resurrected had already been resurrected out of the grave. I thought that I'm sorry. I thought that was one of the weakest responses I've ever received in a formal public debate. Seriously? You can count on one hand the names of those who had been raised from the dead. You can go to Matthew 27:52, and it says, many of those who slept, came out of the tombs after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But to say that the total number, I mean, after all, Jesus said, all of those who are in the grave shall come forth. Yeah, that's anyway, I just thought that was quite a telling moment in the debate. So the whole point being here, since, as you pointed, by the way, next week, I want us to focus on this statement of Christ being exalted to the right hand and how it relates to everything that you pointed out there, because it's so extremely powerful concerning the nature of the Messianic temple. But so next week, I want us to focus on Psalms 110. Sit thou at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Rule thou in the midst of your enemies. And I want us to talk about how that relates to not only the millennial temple, but to the millennium itself, because I think this is very, very important. Do you have any closing thoughts, William?
Not many, other than the fact that this becomes, I think, just a huge opportunity for us to discuss the nature of Christ and, as you say, his reign, as far as his being seated at the right hand of God, and the nature of the tabernacle and the temple and the coming of the Lord. I think there's just so much here, even death and resurrection, because that's what's involved in this process. And so I think as we further develop that, it should, present a lot of good information for people to think on if they have not considered this passage as being that important in terms of looking at those things.
Well, I will simply close with this. In my debate with Richard Carrier, I made the following argument. The kingdom does not come with observation, but the kingdom comes at the time of the resurrection and the parousia. Therefore, the resurrection and the parousia do not come with observation. He had no argument for that. He had no response to that except to say, well, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Thessalonians 4, Second Peter and Second Peter 3, they were all expecting to see something.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
that's the only thing he could offer. He didn't answer the argument, but that's all he could say. So
yep. They come back with the assumption.
that's right. Well, folks, thanks so much for joining us on tonight on Two Guys in the Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. With that, I'm going to say good night and God bless. William, good to see you again. Good night.
Same here. Good night.